Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to first of all wish you and all the House a very happy New Year. And, Mr. Speaker, I would ask this question to ask the Prime Minister if she will make a statement on progress made in achieving legal changes to the EU withdrawal agreement and the timetable in this House for a meaningful vote.
For exiting the European Union. Secretary Stephen Barclay.
I'm sure in a tone that will reflect the year ahead, may I join in agreeing with the Leader of the Opposition and wishing you and colleagues across the House a Happy New Year at the start of the year. Mr. Speaker, as the House will be aware, the Prime Minister today launched a new 10-year plan for the NHS, allocating an extra £20.5 billion a year in funding. And so I am therefore responding on her behalf to the question. I'm sure colleagues across the House recognise the importance of the NHS plan. As confirmed by the Leader of the House in a business statement before the Christmas recess, this Wednesday the House will debate a business motion relating to Section 13(1)(b) of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. This will then be followed by the main debate on Section 13(1)(b), which will continue on Thursday the 10th of January and subject to the will of the House on Friday the 11th. Discussions are taking place through the usual channels as to the proposed length of that debate and indeed the date of that vote. But ultimately it will be a decision for this House through the business motion which will be voted on this Wednesday. Debate will also take place in the House of Lords on Wednesday the 9th, Thursday the 10th and Monday the 14th. Mr. Speaker, the decision to postpone the debate last year was not one that was taken lightly. Over the 2 years of negotiations, the Prime Minister won hard-fought battles. Most importantly, to agree a bespoke deal rather than the flawed off-the-shelf options initially offered. But it was clear from the 3 days of debate that were held in this House that it was not going to pass the deal and that further reassurances should be sought, particularly on the issue of the backstop. Following the European Council in December, a series of conclusions were published which go further than the EU has ever done previously in trying to address the concerns of this House. Over Christmas, the Prime Minister has been in contact with a number of her European counterparts about the further legal and political assurances that Parliament need on the backstop. And my right honourable friend has been in touch with the Taoiseach, and indeed British and Irish government officials have also been in contact over the last week. Securing the additional reassurance that Parliament needs remains our priority, and leaders remain in contact. Leaving the EU with the deal that has been agreed is in the interests of both sides. Mr. Speaker, when the debate begins on Wednesday, the Government will be clear with the House what has been achieved since the vote was deferred last year. As I said when I spoke in the debate on the 4th of December, the deal will enable us to deliver a fair, skills-based immigration system, control over our fisheries policy and our agricultural policies, our trade, well, not unlike the SNP who want to remain in the European approach, our own trade policy for the first time for more than 3 decades, and an ending to sending vast sums of money to the EU. Mr. Speaker, it is a good deal, it's the only deal, and I believe it is the right deal in offering certainty for this country.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank you for granting this urgent question today. With less than 3 months until we reach the Article 50 deadline, there can be no more hiding and no more running away. This issue will define Britain's future and should not be decided by the internal machinations of the Conservative Party. This House and this country deserve much better. A month ago, the Prime Minister shamefully pulled the meaningful vote, promising to do everything possible to secure assurances from the EU on the temporary nature of the backstop. Now the time has come for the Prime Minister to tell the House exactly what legal assurances have been given by EU leaders. She achieved nothing at the December summit, and now surely she has plenty to update us on. And whilst I'm delighted to see the Brexit Secretary here, it's the Prime Minister who should be here to answer these questions. The Prime Minister suggested a breakthrough had been secured last week, and the issue, Mr. Speaker, is that she's not here because she's busy promoting Project Fear. It's all hot air. There seems to be confusion over exactly what the Prime Minister is demanding from the EU. The Leader of the House promised legal reassurances. Yesterday, the Prime Minister told the BBC we're not asking for anything new. So can the Secretary of State clear this up and tell the House exactly what is being requested? This morning, ministers in his own department didn't seem to have a clue. When asked what the PM was demanding, the Brexit minister had to concede he didn't know. But he reassured the whole world by saying that he was an important person. So that's all right. Mr. Speaker, I fear the reason why so many of her cabinet are in the dark is because there is nothing to know. And if this is the case, what guarantees do we have from the Secretary of State that, faced with yet another humiliating defeat, the Prime Minister won't just run away? Can the Secretary of State do what the Prime Minister should be doing today and confirm the timetable for the vote, the meaningful vote, and provide what we've not received before, a cast-iron promise this will not be reneged on yet again? The government is trying to run down the clock in an attempt to blackmail this House and the country into supporting a botched deal. She's refused to work with the majority in the last few months in a desperate attempt to spark life into what is actually a Frankenstein monster of a deal. We're now told if we don't support it, the government is prepared to push our whole economy off a cliff edge. And to prove this, no-deal preparations are underway. The Transport Secretary, who has, a PhD in incompetency in running ministries, has awarded a shipping contract to a company that doesn't have any ships. And even today, we see the farce of lorries being lined up to stage a fake traffic jam in Kent to pretend to the EU that the government is ready for a no deal. A stunt that the Road Haulage Association described as window dressing, and one of the drivers described as a complete waste of time. The government is fooling nobody. These shambolic preparations are too little too late. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, there is no majority in this House to support no deal. Why won't the government face up to this truth and stop wasting our time and our money? The Prime Minister should be here updating MPs on what progress she has achieved, if any. Instead, she's continuing her approach as before Christmas of ducking scrutiny and dodging accountability. We will hold this government to account for their incompetence.
Well, Mr. Speaker, based on the lack of consent in that, it's good to know the Leader of the Opposition had a good break over Christmas. He said about colleagues not knowing. What they don't know is what Labour's plan is. But what they do know, it is one riddled with contradiction. Labour say that they want to remain in a customs union, and yet they also say that they intend to have an independent trade policy, even though the EU have made it clear that that is an area of EU competence. They say that they want to be in the internal market, but at the same time end free movement, even though the two are contradictory. The Shadow Business Secretary says that he doesn't want to rule out the option of a second referendum, and yet the Shadow Education Secretary says that will be a betrayal of the democracy of the main referendum vote. They had a manifesto that said on page 24 that they were going to respect the referendum result. Now they seem to have a policy which is to go back on it. So the confusion that we have is as to what the Honourable Gentleman, actually believes, which is why he started by saying that we couldn't stop Brexit. In past interviews he says we couldn't stop it, and yet his Shadow Secretary says that they can. I'm pleased he started his remarks, Mr. Speaker, by seeming to upgrade me. Last time my role was purely ceremonial. Now he seems to welcome me to my post, and yet seems to suggest that the NHS 10-year plan, an extra £20.5 billion of investment into our NHS, is in some way Project Fear. Well, we're used to Project Fear on the NHS. It is a Project Fear we see from the benches opposite on a regular basis. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that he opposes the preparation for no deal, which any responsible government needs to make, whilst at the same time saying that he will vote against the deal. It is that internal machination in the Labour Party that he needs to address, and is that there was nothing in his contribution to the House today that he has sought to clarify. It is time that he now came clear. Does the Leader of the Opposition maintain the position in the manifesto that they are going to respect the referendum result, or does he agree with his Shadow Secretary and want a second referendum?
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, we have only about 80 days left before the government at the moment is facing a deadline upon which depend crucial decisions that will affect future generations and the whole basis of our political and economic relationships with the rest of the world. We're nowhere near a consensus, either in this House or in the country, about what new arrangements with the European Union we're actually asking for, let alone those which we're likely to achieve. And now we have a completely ridiculous urgent question from the Leader of the Opposition, who has no idea what he wants, and he's just feeling he's got to say something, making a few points about the crisis we're actually in.
Got your number.
Can I ask my right honourable friend, as we are in this position, and as the 29th of March is an entirely arbitrary date, which was accidentally set when the Prime Minister, for no particular reason, decided to invoke Article 50 before she knew what she was going to ask for, isn't it obvious that the national interest requires that we now delay matters by putting off the implementation of Article 50 in order to actually put ourselves in a position where we can negotiate with 27 serious governments by showing that we know what we're asking for and can deliver from our side, and to protect the national interest and future generations?
Well, it's always good to hear from my and learned friend, but where I take an issue with his question is twofold. Firstly, when he says that it's an arbitrary date, when the Article 50 process set a 2-year timeline, and indeed this House voted for the date to be set on the face of the bill. But secondly, and this was a point he touched on in his interview on the Today programme, when he suggested that we would revoke Article 50 with a view to then having a second referendum decision. What the court was clear on is revoking Article 50 cannot be as a tactical device in order to then go back on that decision. It has to be a confirmed intention at that time. And so if it's about extension requires the agreement of all 27 member states. If it is about revoking, what the courts were clear is revoking Article 50 is not about buying more time. It is about making a clear decision that we do not intend at that point to proceed.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I wish you all members and staff a Happy New Year? Mr. Speaker, it is with regret that we return after the Christmas break with no progress from the Government on the withdrawal agreement, and even more remarkable, we return with no Prime Minister in Parliament. She can't be bothered to be here. We're just now days away from the deadline to get a deal to protect our economy, and the Prime Minister isn't in Parliament to explain her lack of progress. Why is the Prime Minister not responding to this urgent question? It is now clear, beyond doubt, that the Prime Minister's tactic is to run down the clock and deprive Parliament of any alternative to her Brexit proposals, bringing the prospect of a no deal closer. Mr. Speaker, the SNP will work across this House to get support for an alternative that is about having another EU referendum, and let the people take back control from this government. I say to the Leader of the Opposition, get off the fence and join us. Stop this government's chaotic Brexit plan. Mr Speaker, shamefully we're exactly the same situation now as before Christmas, with the Tory government again facing defeat, but having wasted a month of precious time. The risks are real. The economic disaster facing our communities across these islands is real. It is suggested that the proposed letter between the UK and the EU regarding the backstop will not come before the debate on the meaningful vote. We cannot operate in the dark. This government must show us the detail and tell us today how it believes these assurances will be enough to win support for its shambolic deal. Moreover, of which is extremely unlikely that the government manages to get its vote through, will it commit to immediately extending Article 50 and remove the threat of the cliff edge? Finally, Mr Speaker, the First Minister of Scotland was very clear today that the events of the last few years have made the case for Scotland being an independent country in charge of our own destiny even stronger. Mr Speaker, Scotland will not be dragged out of the European Union against its will. Our Parliament's powers are being eroded. The UK government is treating the Scottish government with contempt. Even when we seek compromise, our voice, Scotland's voice, is sidelined. This government should wake up to the reality. Scotland knows who is leading in their interest, and, Mr Speaker, it is not the government in Westminster.
Mr Speaker, I think members across the House will recognise that this Prime Minister has spent probably more time at this dispatch box answering questions from colleagues across the House than probably any of her previous incumbents. And indeed, when he asked where she is, as I said in my opening remarks, she is launching the NHS 10-year plan because this party on this side of the House is committed to ensuring that we have an NHS fit for the future, which is what that announcement is about. There does seem, as is inherent in his questions today and in his previous questions, this constant refrain from the SNP, where on the one hand they call for referendums and on the other can't seem to cope with the result of those referendums, whether that was in 2014, in 2016. He is right as to the concern of a no-deal outcome, which is why the best mitigation to a no deal is to vote for the Prime Minister's deal, because that is the only deal that is on the table and reflects over 2 years of hard-fought negotiation with the EU. As to his point in terms of extending Article 50, I touched on this in my reply to the Father of the House. The reality is it is not a unilateral decision as to whether we extend Article 50. That would require the consent of the other 27 member states. And indeed, that would also raise all sorts of practical issues, not least the timing of the European parliamentary elections at the end of May. It is this government's firm intention not to extend Article 50 and to leave the European Union, as the Prime Minister has set out, and the SNP should respect what was the largest vote in the United Kingdom's history.
In calling the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Wokingham, I warmly congratulate Sir John Redwood.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the government understand that opposition to the withdrawal agreement goes way beyond the unacceptable Irish backstop and includes paying huge sums of money with nothing nailed down over the future partnership, and worse still, plunging us into 21 to 45 more months of endless rows and disagreements with all the uncertainty that would bring?
Well, can I, Mr Speaker, join you in congratulating my right honourable friend on his well-deserved knighthood. As to the issue of the interplay between the financial settlement and how a no-deal scenario would be managed, I do think there's a contradiction in, on the one hand, saying that we can leave the EU with no financial contribution, and on the other that there would be sufficient goodwill on the EU side for them to move beyond anything more than contingency planning and offer some sort of managed deal when at the same time we're not honouring the legal obligations that we have.
Sir Vince Cable.
The Leader of the Opposition clarified over the recess that in the event that the Labour Party obtains and wins a general election, it will proceed with Brexit. So what are the Minister's civil service advisers telling it are in any way different from what the government's doing.
Well, Mr. Speaker, not for me to speculate as to what the civil servants would be telling the Leader of the Opposition. I'm not sure they would be having those discussions. But the reality is that it was his party that was the first party to offer an in-out referendum. His party should therefore be respecting the decision, as its then leader said that they would. That was the biggest vote in our country's history, and that is why it's right that we avoid further divisiveness and ensure that we do leave as we said we would.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, may I endorse my right honourable friend, the member for Wokingham's comments about the money side of things. But it's not just that the backstop itself is not sufficient in itself. It is a vital issue, but it is not the whole story by any means. We have the European Court of Justice. We have the question of control over laws. We have the question of the extension of time under Article 132. We have the issue of state aids. And we have the incompatibility of the agreement with the repeal of the 72 Act. There are so many aspects of the withdrawal agreement which is, you may have noticed, if I may say, to the Secretary of State, are matters which go way beyond mere assurances. Reassurances are going to get nowhere, and they're certainly not going to convince anybody who's thinking hard about this when it comes to the vote next week.
Secretary of State.
Well, as my honourable friend will know, the Prime Minister made clear she has heard the concerns of the House in terms of the backstop, and that is subject to the further discussions with European leaders. In terms of its scope, though, it's worth reminding the House that 80% of our economy is covered by services which would not be within the scope of the backstop. So it's worth having some proportion to that discussion. In terms of the other issues, I wasn't sure whether he was saying he wants more freedom for state aid, which would be the position of the Leader of the Opposition. That's not characteristically what I would expect my right honourable friend to be calling for. But the reality is that any deal that we enter into with the EU will require a backstop. That is the substance of it, and whether that is a Canada option or a Canada Plus or a Canada Plus Plus or a Canada Plus Plus Plus, the reality is whatever the deal, it will require a backstop.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Nearly a month has passed since the vote on the Prime Minister's deal was cancelled, and the EU shows no signs of being willing to offer her the legal assurances she says she is seeking about how long the Northern Ireland backstop might last. Unless the Secretary of State can reassure the House today that such assurances will be forthcoming, could I urge the Government to take at least one decision in the national interest now, which is to rule out the disaster that a no-deal Brexit would be for this country?
I'm very mindful of what the chair of the Deputy Select Committee has said on this issue, and indeed the letter signed by a significant number of the members of this House on this issue. The core point with ruling out no deal is that the House has to be for something rather than simply to agree what it is against. And if you look at the signatories on the letter suggesting that no deal should be ruled out, what is clear is the whole spectrum of issues that those members support. The House has to decide what it is for, not simply what it is against.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree with my constituent who runs a chemical business that a no deal would be a disaster for him? And can he give a direct assurance to this House that we will proceed to a vote on the deal next week?
Well, I do think we need to move away from some of the more inflammatory language around the consequences of no deal. But where I do agree with my honourable friend is that there will be significant issues arising from no deal. So I don't support the view that some members have raised, including the DUP spokesman, who is supremely relaxed about the consequences of no deal. I think the consequences of no deal will be material, but I don't think they will be of the inflammatory sort that sometimes we hear and read about in the press.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Lefarydd, a blwyddyn newydd dda i'r tŷ I gyd. It is generally regretted that the British government triggered Article 50 in March 2017. They did so with the aid of the Labour Party and without any semblance of a plan. The result, as people see, is a Parliament consumed by chaos and disorder. Delaying the meaningful vote a day longer only delays the inevitable. Will the Minister admit that his government is now acting as a willing agent of crippling uncertainty to the economy and immediately make good the harm they are choosing to do by bringing forward the vote to this week?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I feel I must slightly correct the honourable lady in that it was the House that voted for Article 50. It was a clear majority of members in this House that voted to trigger the Article 50 letter. In terms of her point around agents of uncertainty, well, the agents of uncertainty are those members who are opposing the deal that will give an implementation period, the deal that will give businesses and citizens the certainty that need, whilst at the same time not coming forward with a proposal that can command the confidence of the House. It is those opposing the Prime Minister's deal who are generating the uncertainty.
Mrs Anne Main.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State's mentioned legally binding agreements. Will the Attorney-General be coming to the House to be challenged on how legally binding some of the agreements will be? Because for those of us that are sceptical about agreements rather than things written in law, I would like to have some of the legal advice that we've already explored explained to us within the House.
Well, my honourable friend is a very experienced member of this House, and she will know that it is the House that governs its business in the House, as has happened in the previous statement, that will be shaped by business motions and what the House does. I mean, it is not normal practice, and this has been an issue of successive governments, for legal advice to be published. There's very good reasons for that, as the Attorney-General set out, but ultimately the House controls its own business.
Right. Mr Barry Sherman.
Speaker, has the Secretary of State been out and about talking to people during the Christmas break? Is he aware that people are saying, here we are in the greatest crisis this country has had in any of our lifetimes, at a time when we can have a 10-year plan for the National Health Service, but no 10-year plan for the future of this country? The people of this country feel let down by politicians on all sides. We have no plan, we have no purpose, we need leadership, and we need it now.
So, well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for acknowledging that we do have a genuine plan for the NHS, and I pay tribute to the work of the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Health on that. In terms of what people said to me and to other members, I'm always slightly wary of that because it is somewhat subjective and there's a tendency for people to select the conversations that suit their argument. But the majority of comments I had from constituents was a desire for us to get on with it, to back the deal and to move forward and end this period of divisiveness. But I'm sure the honourable gentleman will have had different conversations with different constituents.
Mr David Jones.
My right honourable friend has said that the withdrawal agreement, which we intend to recommence debating this week, represents the best deal and the only deal. Are we to infer from that that any legal assurances we may expect to receive from the European Union will stop short of a rewording of that agreement?
So, well, as I said in my opening remarks to my right honourable friend, who as an ex-minister in the Parliament knows these issues extremely well, we will update further on the conversations that the Prime Minister has had with European leaders in the debate starting later this week. And we will set out further comment in terms of the nature of the assurances at that point.
Okay, Harry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the British public are much more aware of what this whole debate about the EU is than perhaps sometimes given credit here? Does he also agree with me that some of the wording and the outrageous scare stories that have been put around about the possibility that we might go over to WTO rules are really outrageous? And will he, as Secretary of State, make sure that his department do everything they can to ensure that the full truth about what a WTO would mean actually gets across to the public, who already, I think, are aware that this is a way forward?
Well, I agree with the honourable lady that it's in no one's interest to cause false alarm. But at the same time, we shouldn't give false comfort. There are material issues to be addressed in terms of no deal. We're working very actively within government to mitigate that, and it's an opportunity to pay tribute actually to the work of many officials during the festive period who maintained their work in the preparation of those no-deal plans. And indeed, we're stepping up our communications on that, the big communication campaign with radio and social media ads tomorrow and in the days ahead on that. But it is also the case that people can't suggest that not honouring our legal obligations, not paying the financial settlement, would allow us to then enter some sort of managed no-deal, which allows us to cherry-pick the bits that we want and avoid the bits we don't.
Greg Hands.
Did my right honourable friend see the interview in the Augsburger Allgemeine on the 11th of December given by Martin Selmayr, the Secretary-General of the Commission, in which he said about the Commission, we have negotiated hard and realised all our objectives. He says that the agreement shows that leaving the EU doesn't work. Other Brussels officials have said that the UK is, quote, locked in, and that, quote, losing Northern Ireland is the price Britain has to pay for Brexit. Is my right honourable friend really as enthusiastic as Martin Selmayr and the Commission about this agreement?
Well, I know my right honourable friend brings a particular specialist interest in terms of his understanding and his engagement in German politics. But the reality is the Prime Minister has been clear throughout, as the political declaration itself makes clear, in terms of the sovereign position on Northern Ireland, that its constitutional status is unequivocally guaranteed. The integrity of the UK's internal market and Northern Ireland's place within it is preserved. The Prime Minister has made that extremely clear. The political declaration makes that clear. But of course, politicians in Germany, just as they will in the UK, will make a various range of statements.
Chris Leslie.
Mr. Speaker, the public are sick and tired of ministers spinning this out and prevaricating. It will have been noticed that he didn't answer the question from the Honourable Lady for Edinburgh. That's a very simple guarantee from the Minister. Will he guarantee that the vote, this meaningful vote, will definitely take place next week?
Yes or no? Secretary of State.
Yes.
Sir Desmond Swain.
The change required is one that will enable us to walk away from negotiations if the deal on offer proves unacceptable to us. As currently drafted, the agreement doesn't allow that possibility, does it?
Well, the scope to exit from the backstop, which is really at the heart of my right honourable friend's question, was explored at length early December, I think the 3rd, 4th of December, with the Attorney-General, where he went with the House into great detail on this specific issue. And the crux of what he said was that this is about a balance of risk. And ultimately, these are political decisions in terms of the ability of a sovereign state to be bound in the future. I know the right honourable gentleman is a assiduous follower of the Attorney-General and his legal advice, and I would commend that earlier debate to him in terms of addressing the point he raises.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There will have been a 35-day abyss between when we were expecting to have the meaningful vote until when we're now told we will have it next week. And this is no prospect of any different outcome from the one we were told we would have before Christmas. I think, Mr. Speaker, it's unforgivable for our businesses, for our public services and for the country that we are having to contend with this uncertainty. He wanted to hear from this House what we wanted to rule out. I can tell him I am for ruling out this uncertainty and a no-deal Brexit. Why isn't he for ruling out that uncertainty?
Well, the best way to avoid the uncertainty is to vote for this deal. But I don't accept the premise of the Honourable Lady's question, because there's been no progress when indeed the EU Council's conclusions from December showed progress in terms of its commitment, its firm determination to work to speedily put in place a subsequent agreement, that the EU stands ready to embark on preparations immediately and so forth. And also, as I said in my opening remarks, the Prime Minister has been having ongoing discussions with European leaders. But the reality in terms of the no deal, which members on all sides of the House have to confront, is that unless the House is for an option, no deal then becomes the alternative, because it is not a unilateral decision of the UK government to extend, and the Council, the courts in terms of its position on revoking, made clear that that would require a breach of the manifesto commitment on which she stood and on which the vast majority of members of this House stood.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
According to that excellent website, theyworkforyou.com, the Prime Minister has assured this House on no fewer than 74 occasions that we will be leaving the EU on the 29th of March. Will the Secretary of State confirm that under no circumstances will that date be postponed?
Secretary of State.
Well, as my honourable friend refers, the Prime Minister has made that commitment crystal clear, and how can one ever dispute what is on They Work For You?
Mr. Angus Brendan McNeill.
Mr. Speaker, thank you and Happy New Year. Even the most deluded can see that the Brexit is not going terribly well. Can the Secretary of State tell us, does the Prime Minister regret creating an international laughingstock of the United Kingdom with Brexit? And when might the delusions the Prime Minister shares with the Tory party and the Labour leadership come to an end? Might it be with the meaningful vote a week next Tuesday? It has to happen sometime.
What I would say, Mr. Speaker, is what is deluded is, on the one hand, to say you want to have more control in Scotland, and on the other hand, is when we get a position where the UK government is getting greater control over its fisheries policy, to say that actually, no, we want to give it back to Brussels. I mean, it is that sort of incoherent policy making from the party opposite, which is why we have this constant revolving door where, on the one hand, they call for referendums, they then lose them, and then they say that they want to have another one.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While, of course, it's right that we debate the manner of our leaving the EU and we have those negotiations, does my right honourable friend agree that the fact that we are leaving the EU was set beyond any doubt by the British people in the 2016 referendum?
Yeah. Well, I agree with my honourable friend that we had a clear instruction from the British people in that election to leave. That was the biggest vote in our democratic history. And I think it is a time, Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister has set out, for the country now to come together after what has been a very divisive period in our public life, and to actually move forward from that referendum debate. And that requires us to honour the referendum result rather than to replay that division on a much more intense scale.
Mr. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State continuously says that there is no alternative plan, but in fact, my honourable friend, the member for Manchester Central, and his honourable friend, the member for Harlow, have produced Common Market 2.0, which sets out how we can leave the European Union, join the European Economic Area. It's a Brexit which deals with concerns about free movement, deals with the backstop, and has a real chance of reuniting our deeply divided country. Will he take the time to read this document and perhaps come back to us with his views?
Well, I know the Honourable Member looked at these issues in detail and very seriously, and I very much respect that. But the issue, and I have looked at the report to which he refers and the work of the member for Harlow on this, but the reality is there is an inherent contradiction in respecting the referendum result and suggesting that we can cherry-pick from the four freedoms, which the EU has always been clear that can't be divided. And so the reality is that the Norway option does not give us, depends if it's Norway or Norway plus, but the reality is that Norway is a population of 5 million people. Much of what is done in terms of rule-taking for Norway is not suitable if I look at areas such as financial services for the UK. And there is an inherent contradiction also in what was committed to in the manifestos of his party and my own, and actually delivering on that referendum result.
Mr. Geoffrey Clifton Brown.
Wish you and the House a constructive new year. Given that
given that neither the EU or the UK wish to be in the backstop for any length of time, could my right honourable friend explain to the House why it is so difficult to agree with our 27 EU partners a short protocol to the withdrawal agreement which would allow the UK to have a unilateral right to withdraw from the backstop in a relatively short period of time?
Well, as my honourable friend will know, there has been some progress in this area in terms of the commitments around best endeavours, in terms of the commitment around it being temporary, and indeed Article 50 requires that the backstop would be temporary. But these are concerns which I know the honourable gentleman has raised and others across the House have raised. These are issues that the Prime Minister is discussing with EU leaders, and we'll have more to say on this in the forthcoming days.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is pathetic. We should have had all of this dealt with by now. We should have voted before Christmas, and we should be moving on to a Plan B. But can I ask the Secretary of State, quite seriously, we don't know when these legal reassurances from the Prime Minister are coming, so will he tell us? Are they going to be given to us today, on Wednesday? When will it be?
To the honourable lady, because I know she feels extremely strongly about this issue. But what is, I think, damaging to our public life is to stand on a manifesto that commits to respecting the result and then to spend time campaigning for a second referendum to undermine that result. That is what is damaging to us, and that is what we on this party are committed to, honouring the referendum result and ensuring that we deliver on it.
Andrew Pridgeon.
From a friend, confirm that this government will never support the betrayal of democracy, which would be a second referendum.
So, well, the Prime Minister has set out the government's position on that, and I refer my honourable friend to the many statements that the Prime Minister has made on that point.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish you a Happy New Year and all members of this House.
Yeah.
One of our most distinguished ex-civil servants, Lord Macpherson, estimated this morning that the earliest time by which a comprehensive trade agreement with the EU could be reached would be by 2025, i.e. 2 years of transition and then 5 years of a backstop. If he doesn't agree with this estimate, why doesn't he agree with that?
Well, I don't think it's surprising, Honourable Lady. I don't agree with that estimate. And the reason for that is because we start from a position of equivalence. After 45 years of close cooperation, we are looking to put in place an agreement based on shared values. And because we have a framework in the form of the political declaration, which acts as an instruction for the next stage of the negotiation.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
You, Mr. Speaker, as the Secretary of State will know, much of the debate in this House is focused around the issue of the Northern Ireland backstop, but not on the principle of guaranteeing that we will not have a return to hard borders that we've seen in the past. Would you agree with me the essential part now of the next week is the government coming forward with the reassurance that this will be a backstop in relation to keeping the border open and not something that the UK will use to be held into that arrangement for extraneous issues like fishing?
Well, I agree with my honourable friend, which is there is a very good reason why the backstop is there, and it's a reflection of two things primarily. First, that the firm commitments that we have under the Belfast Agreement reflecting the difficult history of Northern Ireland and the violence that the people of Northern Ireland have suffered. And secondly, the fact that it is the one part of the United Kingdom that has a shared geography with Ireland. And that is why there is a special circumstance, and that is what requires the backstop. And the reality is that whatever deal is put forward, including whatever deal, if the Leader of the Opposition were to work one out from the party opposite, would still require a backstop.
Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, before I ask my question, can I draw your attention to, unfortunately, some further serious events going on outside Parliament today, intimidation, threats, potentially unlawful actions taking place, targeting members of this House, members of the press, members of the public and peaceful activists. And can I urge you to use your offices with the Metropolitan Police at the highest levels to ensure that proper action is taken on this? This has been repeatedly raised. But can I ask the Secretary of State, Mr. Speaker, there clearly hasn't been progress in the negotiations, there hasn't been progress in the government position, but what there has has been is progress in spending taxpayers' money. So can the Secretary of State tell us how much has the delay that the Prime Minister decided on cost the taxpayer on a daily basis and in total since she delayed that meaningful vote?
So, well first on the first point, obviously, I won't have seen the incidents outside, but anyone who stands at this dispatch box is always mindful of the plaque of Joe Cox, which I know is so dear to many, particularly on the benches opposite, but across the House. And I think all of us would unite that whatever people are on the Brexit debate is that all of us in this House should be able to air their views with respect and proportion. In terms of the issue as to the spending, the reality is that we don't want to be spending money on no deal. The point is the amount of money for no deal has been set out by the Treasury. That is a matter of public record. But the fact is that those who criticise the spending on no deal, which any responsible government needs to do, they need to say, well, why is it they're not backing a deal? Because it is in not backing a deal that it is requiring the government to divert spending to no deal. The best way to avoid spending on a no deal is to back the deal and give the businesses and the citizens the certainty that they need.
Jeremy Fry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As one of the signatories of the letter about the consequences of no deal, particularly around manufacturing, and particularly in the West Midlands, where my constituency is, I think he will appreciate my concern. But the Secretary of State also referred to the fact that 80% of our economy is services. Could he please give his assessment of the impact on services of a no deal on the 29th of March?
Well, I very much recognise the point that my honourable friend is referring to, and perhaps if I pick out one example amongst many, and that would be around data. Data is extremely important within the service economy. Those who look at a debate on saying, well, in a no deal we'll go to WTO and that's going to be completely benign, have not, from what I've seen, addressed the question on data as to what that would mean to service businesses in terms of the data adequacy and how that would flow. So there's many others, but that would be one specific example that would apply in the services economy. But obviously he is very well aware, I know from my discussions with him, he is very well aware from his own constituency interests in terms of the impact on manufacturing as well.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do have to confess to the Secretary of State that I am sad to see it's him and not the Prime Minister, because it would have been helpful to understand with the NHS 10-year plan where becoming the largest purveyor of fridges in the world fits into those effective value for money spending plans. But he can redeem himself to the House today by telling us and answering the question set very clearly by my colleague from Wirral about the legal reassurances that we have been told will change all our minds on this deal. When will Parliament have an opportunity to read them? Will it be before the debate starts on Wednesday? Yes or no?
Well, I did try and address this in my opening remarks, that we would update the House as part of the debate that is coming. We have a significant number of parliamentary hours set aside to do that. I'm not sure, to be honest, knowing the Honourable Lady well, as I do from our time on the Public Accounts Committee, I'm not sure that whatever the legal assurances secured by the Prime Minister will be necessarily enough to divert her from her desire for a second referendum. But I've been clear that we will update the House later this week on the further discussions that the Prime Minister has had.
Chris Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has already referred to the letter calling for the government to rule out no deal. Does the Secretary of State agree that if we were to foolishly rule out no deal, then we'd be left with one of two invidious choices, either remaining or accepting whatever deal the European Union saw fit to grant us? And were the government to agree to this letter, it would fatally undermine our negotiating position, and therefore we should categorically not do it.
Well, as my honourable friend refers, if the government was to say that it wasn't going to have no deal, then the only other option in the event that the Prime Minister's deal is not supported is actually to revoke Article 50, and that is contrary to the manifesto commitments that both parties, both of the main parties, stood on, and I think would be hugely damaging to democracy moving forward.
Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When a permanent secretary isn't happy about being asked to spend money. They seek a written ministerial instruction to make it proper.
Yep.
I have today had in writing from the Department of Transport confirmation that the Permanent Secretary at the Department of Transport sought such a ministerial direction. Doesn't this prove that no deal is a bluff?
Well, the Honourable Lady, I know, given her Treasury experience, will be very familiar with Chapter 3 of Managing Public Money and the requirements on civil servants in terms of their appearance at the Public Accounts Committee in terms of value for money. She'll also know that letters of direction are not a new concept. They have been sought under successive governments. They were sought under the government during her time as a minister. These are not new developments, and that is part of the right checks and balances within government. It's a perfectly proper process.
Simon Orr.
Mr. Speaker, if we want to leave with a deal, and the Leader of the Opposition is right, that's where the majority view of the House certainly is. If we want to end uncertainty for our farmers, for our businesses, for our citizens, isn't it now time to stop playing the party politics and the ideological games and vote for the deal? Because as national politicians, we should surely, all of us, now actually be meaning when we say we are here to act in the national interest.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, which is there's a very clear message from the business community, from citizens, that they want the certainty that the deal offers. They want the implementation period to allow the investment to be made, the planning to proceed. And I think it is time, given the risk of uncertainty that will result from the uncharted waters we'll enter into if the deal does not go ahead, that members of the House do look again at the deal. It's quite a complex set of terms within the withdrawal agreement, and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, we've had a representative of the government come here and make a nebulous statement that could be summed up in 3 words: nothing has changed. It is Groundhog Day again. We've heard nothing new. The only difference is we're now only 81 days before we risk crashing out of the EU. So will he stop playing chicken? Will he show a bit of leadership and hold the meaningful vote this week so we can get on without delay?
Perplexed, Mr. Speaker, as to be accused of playing chicken when I am at the dispatch box answering the Honourable Lady's question. And as was touched on in reply to the Leader of the SNP, I think no one can suggest that the Prime Minister has not been incredibly diligent in her willingness to come to the House and to answer questions, which she has done, I think, Mr. Speaker, very assiduously on many an occasion. In terms of nothing has changed, well, I've referred to that. I think perhaps you prepared that question before hearing the previous answers. And the fact is there have been discussions. There was the political declaration that was made by there was the Council statement made in December. And, of course, we will explore these points in much more detail in the coming days.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whatever happens next, I know that my right honourable friend will agree that having a second referendum will do nothing to move this debate forward. It will create further division and confusion. We've had a people's vote. Now let's get on and prepare to either implement a heavily amended deal or no deal and deliver Brexit on the 29th of March this year.
Well, my honourable friend is right that we have had a vote, and I think for his constituents, just as mine, they want to see that vote respected. And that is what the government is committed to doing. But we should do so in a way that also gives businesses and citizens the certainty they need. That is what the Prime Minister's deal offers, and it's what I commend to the House.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The no-deal planning is clearly a total shambles, including giving a contract to a firm to run ferries who don't have any ferries. So when the government loses its deal, as they surely will next week, would the Minister really contemplate risking leaving the EU without a deal, knowing all the chaos that would create, rather than extend Article 50, or indeed go back to the people and ask them whether they would rather remain in the EU or accept this half-baked deal that the government have agreed?
The honourable lady should be much more candid with the electorate that actually what she is calling for is revoking, because it is not a unilateral decision for the UK government to extend Article 50. That requires agreement of all of the 27 member states. What she is in essence calling is to revoke the Article 50. That is against the manifesto commitment of her party, a manifesto that she stood on, and goes against what people voted for. And if that's her position, that's fine. She's obviously entitled to that, but she should be clear with the electorate that that is what she's calling for. And actually, those members who voted to trigger Article 50 also need to explain why they've changed their mind.
Matt Warman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm totally committed to delivering the Brexit that my constituents voted for, and I know the Secretary of State is as well. So in that context, does he agree with me that it is instructive to note that not a single one of the Leave campaigns were arguing for a no-deal Brexit as their first choice, and that is why this deal is the way of avoiding a no-deal Brexit?
Well, I very much agree with my honourable friend. Part of the reason I personally supported leaving the European Union is I want to be much more global in our approach, to look to the growing economies in China, India, Brazil, look at developing on the work, for example, of the economic and financial dialogues that the Treasury has had in place for a number of years, and look at how we supercharge those and take a much more global approach. Now, the reason for that is because we recognise that the best way to trade with those growing economies is not on WTO basis. It is actually to put in place more bespoke trading arrangements with them. And I find it slightly illogical, on the one hand, to have that global objective, which is to have closer trading relationships with the wider world, at the same time as saying that with our largest trading partner, we can revert back to something we're trying to move away from elsewhere.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Mr. Speaker, and a Happy New Year to all across the House. Will the Prime Minister be bringing all further clarifications and any legal assurances that she has to this House on Wednesday to allow MPs sufficient time to debate them before any meaningful vote?
So, well, as I set out, Mr. Speaker, in my earlier remarks, there will be a business motion on Wednesday where these issues will be discussed as they are prior to that through the usual channels, and the House will have an opportunity to debate these issues in much more detail.
Masterton.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State was kind enough to meet with me before Christmas to discuss some of the concerns that I had with the withdrawal agreement, particularly the fact that the role for the Northern Irish institutions that was in the December joint report hadn't been carried across into the withdrawal agreement. So can he confirm that in the discussions that have been taking place over the Christmas break, looking at the roles for the Northern Irish institutions and the question of regulatory divergence of future has been on the agenda?
Well, my honourable friend raises a very important point, and it is one we have been looking at. And also, I think that's part of a wider question, which is moving forward as we move into the phase 2, how do we actually give a greater role for Parliament as well, and for the devolved assemblies alongside that. So those are issues we're actively looking at, and I very much pay tribute to the work that he has been doing on these issues in terms of bringing them to the fore.
Pat McFadden.
Mr. Speaker, it's a new year, but it does feel like Groundhog Statement, and exactly the same strategy as before, which is trying to force Parliament to choose between a bad deal for the UK while talking up the even worse consequences of no deal at all. So further to the question asked by my honourable friend, the member for Bishop Auckland, could the Secretary of State set out today how much was spent on the farcical exercise of having 100 lorries drive around Kent? And what does he think this does to the international reputation of the UK? Does he think any other country is looking at this exercise and thinking Brexit would be a great example to follow?
I think what the rest of the world will be looking at is the fact that we've had a democratic vote, and whether as a Parliament we respect and honour that democratic vote. In terms of the deal, I think it's not just what the UK government says, it's also what the EU government has said, and the EU Commission have been clear, which is that this is the only deal. And I think the idea that in the remaining days someone can go back to the Commission and negotiate a completely different deal
is just not credible. In terms of the specific question on what the precise cost has been in terms of the contingency planning, clearly the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, very experienced member. I'm sure a written parliamentary question or other will be put in due course. I've answered many from him, and I know he'll be very assiduous in posing those. So that will be a question I'm sure DFT will answer. But I mean, the substance of this is that we don't want to be spending money on no deal preparation, which is why we should support this deal and bring the certainty that the deal offers. But it is the responsible thing for a government to do to prepare for no deal if there is uncertainty over that vote.
Rachel Macleay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's going to be just 73 days from when the government's deal is voted down in this place until the 29th of March. So could the Secretary of State tell the House what discussions he, the Prime Minister, all their officials have had with the EU about extending Article 50?
I think if I can unpick that, because there's been extensive discussions with EU leaders, but not on the issue of extending Article 50. The extensive discussions have been in terms of the concerns the House has raised over the backstop, and the Prime Minister has had conversations with the German Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister Rutte, Donald Tusk, President Jean-Claude Juncker and President Macron. And of course, as I said in my statement, also with the Taoiseach. So there's been extensive discussions with European leaders, but that has been in terms of getting assurances in line with the concerns of the House.
Okay. Carol Monaghan.
A broken economy is an opportunity for those with money and connections to exploit to their own advantage. Can he tell us how many more furtive contracts, such as the seaborne freight, we should expect over the next 81 days?
Well, it is not a broken economy that is putting £20.5 billion a year extra into the NHS and investing in a long-term plan. It is not a broken economy that is seeing the lowest unemployment rate for over 40 years. This is a sign of the government taking the difficult decisions on the economy, and we now have an industrial strategy which is ensuring that we start to drive the productivity that the economy needs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State has repeatedly asked us for the House to say what it wants. Now, I think the House has said many times lots of different versions of what it wants, but I'll give him one example he could toy with. Why won't the government give us a vote on staying in the customs union?
Well, I was pleased because the Honourable Lady is clear in terms of what she wants. The point that I was raising was what is it that would have the consensus of the House? Because it's easier for the House to say and unite behind positions that it is against. The point that I was raising was to what extent there are positions that the House will unite against. The issue with the custom... Oh, come into it. Well, it's always nice to know what the Labour policy is, because it keeps changing. 1 minute it can't stop Brexit, then a minute it can. Well, I was just answering the heckle from the front bench, but I come back to the Honourable Lady's. Well, if her colleagues will stop heckling, I'll happily come back to her question. The question she was asking was in terms of the customs union, and the fact is that we want to have an international trade policy, and we can't have it both ways. We can't, on the one hand, say we'll be part of a customs union, and yet at the same time expect the EU Commission to give us unilateral control of our trade policy.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has changed her policy on whether or not we should leave the European Union. She changed her policy on no deal being better than a bad deal. She changed her policy on this is the best possible deal and then went off to try and get a better one. Is the reason that he is here instead of the Prime Minister that the Prime Minister has finally realised what we all realised a long time ago? The Prime Minister has lost the plot, is no longer in control of these negotiations, and should be packing her bags and going.
I mean, the reality, Mr. Speaker, is the Prime Minister was committed to respecting the referendum result. That is what she has done. And she set out a manifesto commitment to honour the referendum result. That is what she has done. She's been consistent in both.
Yes. Paul Sweeney.
Mr Speaker. Well, I'm looking forward as a birthday present next week to voting down this terrible deal, which is going to lead the country into a much worse position than it is currently. But can the Minister also confirm that it's not then going to be the default that the country will drop out under a no-deal situation, because it's in the gift of the government to use its powers to withdraw Article 50 if it came to it? So will he confirm that actually it would be the government's discretion to allow a no-deal Brexit to happen?
Well, the honourable gentleman can't have it both ways. He can't on the one hand say he's voting against the deal and then sort of pray against the uncertainty that will result from voting against that deal. We've already covered this point, Mr Speaker, on a number of occasions. The UK government cannot unilaterally extend Article 50. It requires the consent of the other 27 member states, and there are practical issues, as I set out, such as the timings of the European parliamentary elections, even if it wanted to do so. But to be very clear to him, it is not the government's policy to extend Article 50, nor is it the government's policy to revoke Article 50. And I'm sure many members of the House thought that was also Labour's policy. I'm sure many of their own voters thought it was their policy based on their manifesto. And what he needs to be clear is, if he is voting against the deal, is he going back on the manifesto on which he stood or not?
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Before Christmas, this House had a great deal of problem getting hold of a copy of the Attorney-General's advice. If there was now going to be any change to the deal itself, or any explanatory wording agreed to sit alongside the deal, could I suggest to the Secretary of State that he would run the risk, once again, of the government being held in contempt if it withheld any changes in the Attorney-General's advice, subsequent to any changes to the deal or explanatory wording, that then made that advice different? So could I say to him, would he then avoid the issue of, once again, getting into contempt by giving an assurance to the House here and now that if there is any change to the advice, that change will be given to this House, or confirmation given that the advice hasn't been changed at all?
Well, I mean, Secretary of State, it won't surprise you that no minister wants to be found in contempt of the House, and obviously any potential to be found in such contempt will be taken extremely seriously, and the government would look at that and respond accordingly.
Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased that the Secretary of State has read the proposal that I put forward with the Honourable Member for Harlow for a Common Market 2.0. But given that Plan A is almost but doomed now, and that the Secretary of State says he wants to know what the House is for, will he ensure that after the vote next week, he and his team come forward with a series of votes on Plan B to this House, including our proposal for a Common Market 2.0, so that he can have a very clear view what the House is for?
Well, I do respect the work that the Right Honourable Lady has done, and the seriousness with which she and the member for Harlow have looked at this issue, and I think tried to engage with it in a material way. I have set out my concerns with the substance of it, but that does not negate from the work that has been done. In terms of the question as to whether there would be indicative votes or not, I mean, the reality is that, if the deal does not go ahead, we will be in uncharted water, and we will need, as a government, to look at that. But, you know, it is our policy to win the vote. That is what the entire government is focused on, and we will continue to make that case to colleagues on all sides of the House.
Chris Stevens.
Mr Speaker, good new year to you and all, and money may you see. Can the Secretary of State confirm that the emergency services contract and any other contracts to do with no-deal Brexit will not be part of the EU procurement process or procurement rules? And what does the Secretary of State believe it means when the UK government can produce worse procurement than the European Union?
Well, as to whether there's a specific point in terms of emergency services contracts, that's something on which I'm cited, but I'm very happy to have a discussion with the honourable gentleman in terms of any specific concern he has on procurement. As I think members of the House know, I share the desire of many others in terms of value for money and ensuring we procure in an effective way. So if there's a specific issue behind his question, I'm very happy to discuss that with him.
Meg Hillier.
Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State has repeatedly told us that the government has been preparing for no deal, yet it was under legislation that allows for the award of contracts outside the normal rules that the Department for Transport spent nearly £14 million on a ferry company with no ferries. And we've also seen the issues around Operation Brock in Kent. Given that his department's job is to assure itself and Parliament that the government is prepared for Brexit, what's he say about the Department of Transport? Is it really up to the job?
Well, I know the Right Honourable Lady, through her chairmanship of the Public Health Committee, looks at these issues in detail. I'm sure we'll be looking, I suspect, at these contracts in due course. And indeed, my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, has answered a series of questions on this over the festive break in terms of addressing the concerns to which she refers. The reality is that a responsible government does need to put in place contingency arrangements. It does need to ensure that we have additional capacity in terms of our borders. That is the responsible things to do, and the individual mechanics of that are obviously issues that I'm sure she, through the Public Accounts Committee, will explore.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's nearly a month since the government pulled the original meaningful vote. So can the Secretary of State tell the House, and indeed the country, what percentage of either the EU withdrawal agreement or the political declaration would have changed by the time we recommence that debate on Wednesday?
Well, with respect, Mr. Speaker, I think it's a fairly specious issue to look at what percentage, because surely it is the quality of the change rather than necessarily how many words one counts in the text. So I don't think it's about going through and saying, well, what percentage has changed. The issue is the Prime Minister has been very clear that she is seeking further legal and political assurances. We've already covered in the course of this urgent question the fact that we will explore these points in the coming days, and I look forward to having further debates with the honourable gentleman on that point.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've had a written statement today from the Transport Secretary on the Government's Brexit no-deal contracts with the self-styled ferry operators Seabourn Freight. And the written statement says that the negotiated procurement procedure without prior publication was concluded as allowed under Regulation 32 of the Public Contracts Regulations. I've been studying them fairly closely, and they seem to envisage an emergency situation brought about by events unforeseeable by the contracting authority. Now, it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that it's been foreseeable by the government and by everyone in this country for some time that there might be a no-deal situation. So are the government going to publish the legal advice which enabled them to proceed under Regulation 32, and if so, when can we expect to see it?
I respect the point that the Honourable and Learned Lady is making, but the reality is that she is critical of the government when we don't prepare for no deal, and then she is critical of the government when we do prepare for no deal. And the reality is, it is the responsible thing for a government to do is to ensure we have additional capacity, and with the timescales short, that it was necessary to follow a specific procurement route, as the Secretary of State, my right honourable friend, has set out.
And Paula Sheriff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State this afternoon has alluded to various contingency arrangements that his government is making in the event of a no deal. And further to the question made by my honourable friend for Hackney South and Shoreditch, I just wondered if you could tell us exactly why a ferry company that doesn't own any ships and appears to have some very spurious terms and conditions on its website has been awarded a contract worth over £13 million. And if you could also tell us if we can assume the same level of diligence will be completed if any further contracts are issued.
Well, the reason is quite straightforward, that against a finite deadline in terms of time of leaving the European Union, we do need to put in contingency plans. It was the case that we were hoping to have secured the deal, which would have meant we wouldn't have needed to put in that no-deal contingency arrangements. But given the level of uncertainty, that has been necessary, and that is a responsible thing for a government to do, to prepare for all eventualities.
I didn't answer the question.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Joanna Adams from Strathbungo emailed me yesterday deeply concerned about this whole situation. She says, "I can't believe with only a couple of months to go we still don't know what's happening. To have the options of the PM's terrible deal or a no deal seems incomprehensible to me." Mr. Speaker, it's incomprehensible to most of us, including the 880 people who emailed me from the Exit Brexit website. Mr. Speaker, the reality is we're 81 days before we have to get out of the EU. We are running out of time. Is it not the case that running out of time is inevitable and extending Article 50 is essential?
I mean, I do respect, Mr. Speaker, the 800 and odd people that emailed her on this, but the reality is 17.4 million voted in the referendum, and it is on their mandate that this government is acting. The reality is that the best way to avoid the uncertainty of a no deal, and unlike some members of the House, I don't think that a no deal is a no-risk option, or I'm supremely relaxed about it. I think there are risks with no deal, but we are planning and preparing to mitigate those risks. But the best way to mitigate the risks of no deal is to vote for the Prime Minister's deal.
Mr. Richard Burden.
Can I put to the Secretary of State that if you're a company that has no idea how long the delay will be to trucks vital for your export and import business, what the delays will be of a no-deal Brexit, it's not a lot of comfort to be told that the government has issued a multi-million-pound contract to a ferry company with no ships, or that it's going to have an airport in Kent to park your trucks when they can't get to where they're meant to get. Will he not recognise that the growing demand from business and from members of this House is that a no-deal scenario is not possible? The chaos has not got to be mitigated, it's got to be avoided, it's got to be rejected. So there are different ways of doing that, some multilateral, some unilateral. But why will he not join that growing chorus and say, rule out no deal, because that is in the interest of this country?
Look, the honourable gentleman really goes to the heart of the issue, which is I am seeking to rule out no deal by backing the Prime Minister's deal. But the difference is he isn't. So he stands on a manifesto that says he will honour the referendum result, then says that he doesn't want to support the Prime Minister's deal, but then wants to complain about the consequences of no deal. I agree with him there will be disruption from a no deal. That is why he should be supporting the Prime Minister's deal.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary will be aware that as things stand with the proposed withdrawal agreement, there is no legal guarantee that means the common fisheries policy will end in December 2020. There is no legal separation of fishing negotiations from general trade. But if the backstop is invoked, by law, tariffs will apply to Scottish exports, but not Northern Ireland exports. Does he therefore agree that any Scottish Tory voting for the so-called deal does so in the knowledge that these are the facts, that platitudes will not change?
No, I think we have really a misrepresentation of the reality of what the political declaration says. The political declaration is absolutely clear that we will be taking control of our coastal waters. We will be in a position to negotiate in the same way as other states such as Iceland. And the real betrayal is why his party want to sell out Scottish fishermen and women and sell them out by selling off the policy back into the EU.
Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since Article 50 was triggered 2 years ago, a full 9 months after the EU referendum result, we have seen staggering incompetence from the Tory government and dangerous and deliberate constructive ambiguity from the opposition party in what is the biggest issue facing the UK since the Second World War. Does the Secretary of State think that, regardless of how people voted in the EU referendum, does he think that this shambolic spectacle has enhanced or diminished faith in politics?
Well, I think what we have seen is the Prime Minister working day and night in the national interest to fight for a deal for the entire United Kingdom, to secure through that 2-year negotiation a withdrawal agreement which allows us, after 40-odd years, to wind down our deeply ingrained relationship with the EU and to set a course through the political declaration for a future relationship that both respects our trading relationship with our largest trading partner, but also allows an independent trade policy with the rest of the world and gives us control of our immigration system and gives us control of fishing and agriculture. I think that responds to the work that the Prime Minister has put in.
Neil Gray.
Mr. Speaker, it seems very little has changed in the month since the meaningful vote was postponed, either in terms of the legal changes secured from the EU or in terms of the opinion of this House. So, given that it seems inevitable that he is to lose the meaningful vote next week, what is the Secretary of State's plan B?
Well, we've already covered this, I think, on a number of occasions, but it is the government's intention to win that vote, and that is what all ministers in government are focused on.
Order. Yes, exceptionally, I will take the honourable gentleman's point of order now because it relates to Brexit protest, and therefore there seems an apposite quality about hearing what the honourable gentleman has to say at this point. Point of order, Mr Nicholas Bowl.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. If this place stands for anything, it is the freedom of expression, and you, sir, are the greatest defender of that freedom. But that freedom must also be accompanied by safety, personal safety, in particular for honourable and right honourable members. Now, we have heard reports from the honourable member for Cardiff and Penarth of the threatening behaviour of certain protesters towards the right honourable member and my friend for Broxtowe. And would you, Mr Speaker, consult with the Sergeant-at-Arms to see whether the Metropolitan Police is doing everything it can, yes, to protect the public's right to protest, but also to ensure that honourable members are able to go about their business in total safety?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his point of order, with which I entirely identify. I'm happy to take other colleagues in due course, but there is nothing that the honourable gentleman has said to which I object in any way, and I share both the sentiment that he's expressed and his strength of feeling on behalf of colleagues about this matter. Naturally, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving me advance notice of this point of order. I have indeed, I must tell the House, been made aware of recent incidents involving aggressive and threatening behaviour towards members and others by assorted protesters who have donned the yellow vests used in France. And when I referred a moment ago to recent incidents, I am more specifically referring to reports I've had of incidents that have taken place today. In all likelihood, when many of us, myself included, have been in this chamber. The House authorities are not technically responsible for the safety of members off the estate. That is and remains a matter for the Metropolitan Police. But naturally, I take this issue very seriously, and so I am sure do the police, who have been made very well aware of our concerns. Reflecting and reinforcing what the honourable gentleman said about peaceful protest, let me say this. Peaceful protest is a vital democratic freedom, but so is the right of elected members to go about their business without being threatened or abused, and that includes access to and from the media stands in Abingdon Green. I am concerned at this stage, I say no more than that I am concerned at this stage about what seems to be a pattern of protests targeted in particular, I don't say exclusively, but in particular at women. Female members, and in a number of cases I'm advised, female journalists have been subjected to aggressive protest and what many would regard as harassment. I can assure the House that I am keeping a close eye on events, and I will speak to those who advise me about these matters. And I would like to thank the honourable gentleman for doing, I think, a public service in raising the issue as he's done. And I don't want to dwell on it for long, because we do have other important business to which we must proceed. But if colleagues with relevant experiences particularly want to come in at this point, then of course they can. Yes. Point of order, Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm very grateful to you for the statement that you've just given. I was down at the Green earlier this afternoon and witnessed what had happened. and there was a completely unacceptable level of abuse being directed at the Honourable Member for Broxtowe and at the Sky journalist Kay Burley. I completely agree with the Honourable Member for Grantham. Peaceful protest near the vicinity of this Parliament is a hugely important and valuable part of our democratic traditions. But intimidation and abuse are not peaceful protest. And I would just agree with the point that's been made and ask you to use your good offices, sir, to do everything that you can to ensure that journalists and broadcasters can do their job and that members of this House are free to speak their minds.
I happily give the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, that undertaking. Point of order, Mary Cray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to that point of order, this is not the first such incident. There was an incident that took place before Christmas and where a number of us wrote to the Chairman of Ways and Means. And as a result of that, there are now police officers stationed outside the Abingdon Green area, but they're not necessarily on the way in and out, which is where I think some of this latest incidents took place. People do have the right to protest freely, but they also have the responsibility to conduct themselves in an appropriate way. And what we have seen once more again, most regrettably directed at the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Broxtowe, has been really vile, misogynist thuggery, abuse and harassment. And we in this place remember that our friend Jo Cox was murdered by a far-right neo-Nazi in 2016. We remember that people have gone to prison for plotting to murder another Labour MP, and that many people have been jailed for the abuse that they have committed other colleagues. And so this is something which, as you say, seems specifically directed at women, has a strong streak of misogyny, and is now being Facebook lived, streamed in order to raise revenue for these far-right people to fund their trolling activities online and in the real world. So can I ask also, Mr. Speaker, that you write to Twitter and Facebook, and that these individuals' sites, wherever they pop up and under whose name ever they appear, are shut down, so that these individuals are not profiting from filming their abuse of MPs who are rightly speaking out on the important national issues of the day, and all solidarity to the Right Honourable Lady for Broxtowe.
Can I just say to the Honourable Lady that the last point that she raised is new to me. I have heard it from her for the first time, and I will carefully reflect on it. I'm perfectly open to taking the course of action that she has recommended, but I hope she'll forgive me if I say that I will just want to consult her about the best way in which to proceed. But I've got no hesitation in saying that I share 100% the concerns that have been expressed, and it is necessary to state very publicly the difference between peaceful protest on the one hand and aggressive, intimidatory and threatening protest on the other. The idea that one can't make a distinction between the two is not right. It isn't always straightforward, but it can be made, and it must be. And if there are no further points of order